When Clint Eastwood walked into an upscale LA restaurant, no one expected a single red hat would turn the entire dining room against him. But what happened next? It stunned the whole city and left even his harshest critics speechless. This is not just a story about a hat. It's a story about dignity, courage, and a lesson every single one of us needs to hear. Hit subscribe now, because this is one moment you'll never forget. Clint Eastwood had walked into countless rooms where all eyes turned to him. But today, it wasn't because of who he was. It was because of what he was wearing. He stepped into LA Terrace, one of Los Angeles' most elite restaurants, a place where Hollywood's most powerful gathered, sipping fine wine beneath chandeliers that bathed the room in gold. Conversations were low, calculated. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain blended with the distant hum of a classical piano. Clint moved with his usual quiet confidence, a faded button-down shirt tucked into well-worn denim, a weathered leather jacket draped over his broad shoulders, and atop his head, the unmistakable red MAGA hat. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't a challenge. To him, it was just a hat. But to the people around him, it was something far more. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Eyes flickered toward him, whispers exchanged behind half-raised menus. The staff hesitated. It wasn't his name causing the reaction. It was the hat. And in a place built on exclusivity, that hat was about to spark something no one expected. The afternoon sunlight spilled softly through the glass windows of LA Terrace, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Los Angeles. The clink of silverware against porcelain mixed with the low hum of conversations, creating an atmosphere both refined and distant, the kind of place where appearances mattered almost as much as the food itself. In the midst of all that polished elegance, Clint Eastwood stepped inside. His boots made a quiet thud against the marble floor, worn but steady. He wasn't dressed for a place like this. Faded jeans, a weathered leather jacket, and a face carved by time and hard living. But the real contrast wasn't his clothes. It was the hat, bright red, simple letters. A MAGA cap sitting firmly atop his head. To Clint, it was just a hat, part of who he was. To everyone else, it was something else entirely. The room didn't fall silent, but you could feel it. The subtle shift, the pause in conversations, the brief glances stolen over half-filled wine glasses. Clint felt it too, but if it bothered him, he didn't show it. After all, he'd spent a lifetime walking into rooms where people had already made up their minds about who he was. With the slow confidence of a man who answered to no one, he found a seat by the window, where sunlight caught the edges of his jacket. A waiter approached, polite but hesitant, offering the menu with both hands. Clint accepted it, his fingers rough against the polished paper. For a brief moment, it seemed like the room might settle back into comfort. But that's when the manager appeared. Sharp suit, tighter smile, and eyes locked onto the hat. The manager stood stiffly at the edge of Clint's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him like a man preparing to enforce the law. This wasn't just any manager. This was the guardian of LA Terrace's reputation, a place known not just for its food, but for its exclusivity. Everything here, from the folded napkins to the crystal chandeliers, was designed to impress a certain type of crowd, and Clint, with his dusty jacket and unmistakable red hat, didn't fit that image. The manager cleared his throat, pitching his voice just loud enough for nearby tables to overhear. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat. We have a policy against political attire in this establishment." Clint finally looked up from his menu. His face was calm, stone steady. No irritation. No apology. Just the quiet gaze of a man who had been through more confrontations than anyone in the room could imagine. "I wasn't aware of that rule," Clint said, his tone even, almost conversational. There was no fight in his voice, but also no hint of compliance. Just a simple statement, straight as a gun barrel. The manager's fingers tightened slightly, his professional smile thinning. He motioned toward the entrance, vaguely referencing a set of policies that, truth be told, were nowhere to be seen. "We try to maintain a neutral environment here, sir." Clint didn't argue. But the subtle tilt of his head said everything. His eyes swept the room, couples pausing mid-conversation, forks hovering above plates, all waiting to see how this would play out. "I'm not here to make a statement," Clint said. "Just here for lunch." The manager's stance shifted from polite to unyielding. "I'm sorry, sir. Either the hat comes off or I'll have to ask you to leave." The silence stretched like a taut wire. For a brief moment it felt like everyone, including Clint, was measuring the weight of what came next. Then, without hesitation, Clint pushed back his chair. The soft scrape of wood against marble sounded louder than it should have. He rose, slow and steady, his every move deliberate, like a man who understood that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. "If that's your rule," Clint said, "then I'll leave." No bitterness, no raised voice, just calm acceptance. With a small nod, Clint adjusted the hat ever so slightly. Less like a statement, more like settling it comfortably into place. And then, just as quietly as he had come in, Clint walked out. Behind him, conversations slowly resumed, but they were different now. Quieter, more self-conscious, as if LA Terrace itself wasn't quite sure what had just happened. Stepping outside, Clint paused for a brief moment, allowing the warm California breeze to wash over him. He inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly, as if releasing the weight of the moment that had just unfolded. But inside him, there was a quiet shift. Reaching up, he adjusted his hat slightly, not out of defiance, but as a reaffirmation of something personal, an unspoken decision to hold firm in his own sense of identity. He wasn't particularly upset, frustrated perhaps, disappointed certainly, but anger? Number Clint Eastwood had never been one to let emotions cloud his judgment. He walked without hurry, his boots making a steady rhythm against the pavement as he made his way down the street. A few blocks later, he arrived at a small public park, a modest green space with scattered benches, a few towering oak trees providing shade, and a fountain trickling softly at the center. The city carried on around him, but here, there was a sense of stillness, a place to think. Finding an empty bench, Clint sat down, resting his forearms on his thighs as he stared at the ground for a long moment. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn at the edges, its pages filled with years of thoughts, observations, and quiet reflections. With a practiced ease, he flipped it open, thumbed past pages of old notes, and pulled a pen from his pocket. He didn't write an angry rant. No declarations of outrage, no self-righteous statements about injustice. Instead, he simply noted down a few quiet thoughts, scribbling in the same deliberate, measured way he had approached everything else in life. How quickly we define people by what they wear, not who they are. How a piece of cloth can carry more weight than a lifetime of character. How little room is left for conversation when judgment is the first instinct. The words came slowly but deliberately. He wasn't looking for answers, just understanding. Back at the restaurant, the tension had not yet dissipated. Conversations had resumed, but not quite as naturally as before. There was an unease lingering in the air, as if people were still processing what had just happened. Near the bar, a waiter hesitated before leaning toward the manager and lowering his voice. "Do you think that was the right call?" That was Clint Eastwood. The manager barely glanced up. He waved a dismissive hand, his expression unreadable. Rules are rules. We can't make exceptions. But even as he spoke, there was the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his voice, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. By the time Clint got home, the world had already taken notice. What began as a quiet moment in a restaurant had now ignited a storm online. Photos of Clint walking out, hat still on, face unreadable, circulated within minutes. "They kicked out Clint Eastwood over a hat," one tweet read. Another questioned, "So much for neutrality at LA Terrace." The debate exploded. Some defended the restaurant's right to enforce its policies, but many saw the decision as hypocrisy, a selective enforcement of so-called neutrality. The backlash was swift. Comments flooded the restaurant's social media. Reservations dropped. Inside LA Terrace, The usual lively chatter had faded, replaced by unease. The manager, once confident the controversy would blow over, now scrolled through endless criticism. For the first time, doubt crept in. Had he made the right call? Meanwhile, Clint wasn't interested in outrage. He wasn't seeking apologies or boycotts. Instead, he made a call. By morning, a quiet gathering had taken shape outside LA Terrace, not a protest, but a conversation. A single banner stretched across, "United we stand, building bridges, not walls." There were no speeches, no defiance, just a space for people to talk, to listen. A different kind of response. A statement made, not in anger, but in action. Outside LA Terrace, the atmosphere had changed. What started as a quiet gathering had grown into something more, a conversation. Restaurant staff who had tried to ignore it now found themselves drawn to the energy outside. A few employees stepped out, curious, while familiar patrons, those who once filled the restaurant's elegant dining room, mingled among the crowd, engaged in discussions that wouldn't have happened a day ago. Inside, the manager stood by the window, watching. The discomfort that had gnawed at him since Clint walked out had only grown. This wasn't a protest, not a scene of defiance. It was something far simpler. People talking, listening, understanding. And that realization unsettled him. A waiter, who had been outside for some time, stepped back in and hesitated before speaking. "You should go out there," he said, his voice careful but firm. The manager stiffened. His instinct was to dismiss the idea, to stand by his decision. But as he watched the quiet way Clint moved through the crowd, his posture calm, his presence effortless, something inside him shifted. He took a deep breath, unpinned his name tag, and set it down on the counter. Straightening his tie, he stepped outside. As the manager walked toward the gathering, he saw Clint standing by the main table, listening intently. When their eyes met, Clint gave a polite nod. Acknowledgement, nothing more. The manager swallowed hard before speaking. "I need to say something," he began, his voice quieter than intended. "I didn't handle things well yesterday. I thought I was protecting the neutrality of this place, but I realize now that I acted out of fear, not fairness." Clint remained silent, his expression steady, his posture unchanged. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. Calm, measured, without judgment. Takes courage to admit that. A beat of silence. Then, applause, not forced, not exaggerated, just genuine. This was never just about a hat. It was about perception, how quickly people take sides, how easily they judge, and how rarely they stop to listen. It was about a world where symbols outweigh the people who wear them, where a single piece of clothing can dictate how someone is treated before they even say a word. Clint Eastwood, a man who had built his life on quiet strength rather than loud rhetoric, didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he responded with action, not anger. While others react with hostility, he chose something far more powerful: restraint, patience, and understanding. In a world so often fractured, his message was clear. We don't have to see eye to respect each other. We don't have to agree to have a conversation. And sometimes, the most powerful response isn't loud. It's simply choosing to walk away with dignity. If you believe in the power of respect over division and conversations over conflict, then join us. Hit the subscribe button now to hear more powerful stories that challenge perspectives, inspire thought, and remind us that sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest.